The Grand Egyptian Museum is no longer a promise or a political press release. After years of partial previews and delayed timelines, it formally opened to the public in early November 2025. That date matters because it marks the end of one of the longest, most expensive, and most politically exposed cultural construction projects of the modern era. This is not simply a museum opening. It is Egypt cashing in a decade-long bet that history, when packaged correctly, can function as infrastructure, diplomacy, and revenue at the same time. The museum sits roughly 2 kilometers from the Giza pyramids, an intentional decision that says more than any marketing slogan. Egypt is not moving its past into a neutral white cube. It is docking a $1 billion structure directly next to its most valuable global asset. The logic is blunt. Tourists already come for the pyramids, so the museum becomes a compulsory extension of the visit rather than an optional detour into Cairo traffic. This is urban planning by funnel, not romance. The scale reflects that ambition. The Grand Egyptian Museum covers roughly 484,000 square meters of floor space on a site spanning about 120 acres. It is, by measurable standards, the largest archaeological museum on Earth. Those numbers are not decorative. They are meant to signal permanence and dominance in a competitive global tourism market where countries increasingly sell curated heritage experiences rather than raw history. The investment figure is usually rounded to $1 billion, but international financing documents and contractor disclosures suggest the real cost crept beyond that threshold. Once delays, currency shifts, and pandemic disruptions were factored in. Japan's international cooperation agencies underwrote a significant portion of the funding through low-interest loans, a reminder that cultural prestige projects are often geopolitical collaborations dressed up as domestic achievements. Egyptian officials describe the museum as a gateway to the ancient world, but that phrasing understates the economic calculus. According to Tourism Ministry data, Egypt received approximately 15.7 million international visitors in 2024, its strongest year on record. Tourism revenue that year exceeded $13 billion. The Grand Egyptian Museum is designed to lock in and expand that momentum by increasing visitor, dwell time, and average daily spending, not by inspiring awe alone. The message to the outside world is clear. Egypt is not content to be an open-air ruin visited for photographs and then abandoned for beach resorts. It wants to reposition itself as a structured cultural economy, where history is interpreted, monetized, and controlled within a modern institutional framework. That shift explains why the museum is being framed not as a cultural accessory, but as national infrastructure. Critics have already noted the irony. A civilization famous for building eternal monuments now relies on climate control systems, ticketing algorithms, and crowd flow modeling to protect artifacts that survived 3,000 years without them. But irony does not pay operating costs. Visitor volume does. From the first day of full operation, the museum has been treated less like a sanctuary and more like a system. Capacity limits, timed entry windows, and transportation routing from Cairo and Giza were all tested during soft openings. This is a museum designed for throughput, not wandering. The goal is efficiency, predictability, and scale, qualities more commonly associated with airports than temples. That is the context in which the Grand Egyptian Museum must be understood. It is not a nostalgic tribute to the past. It is a contemporary economic instrument built from ancient material, positioned to convert global fascination into long-term revenue and soft power. Whether that conversion succeeds is the real story. The opening was only the first transaction. The Grand Egyptian Museum did not emerge because Egypt suddenly decided it needed a bigger building. It emerged because the old system stopped working, and everyone knew it. For decades, the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square carried a symbolic weight far heavier than its infrastructure could handle. Built in the early 20th century, it was never designed to host millions of visitors a year, nor to manage a collection that eventually ballooned into the tens of thousands of artifacts packed into dim halls and aging display cases. By the late 1980s, the problem was no longer academic. Artifacts were stacked, labels were outdated, climate control was inconsistent, and security protocols reflected another era. Visitors complained, conservators warned, and international partners quietly questioned whether Egypt could continue lending and receiving artifacts under those conditions. The museum was not failing because of neglect. It was failing because it had become a victim of its own success. That pressure forced a reckoning. In 1992, the Egyptian government formally acknowledged that incremental fixes were no longer enough. Renovation would not solve structural limits, and expansion in downtown Cairo was politically and logistically unrealistic. The decision was not to modernize the old museum, but to leapfrog it entirely. The brief was radical for its time. Build a new institution from the ground up that could absorb the full weight of Egypt's archaeological inheritance while meeting international conservation standards. This was not framed as a cultural indulgence. Internal planning documents from the early 1990s positioned the new museum as a strategic response to three converging risks. First, the physical risk to artifacts from overcrowding and environmental instability. Second, the reputational risk of appearing unable to steward a global heritage responsibly. Third, the economic risk of underutilizing assets that already drew millions of visitors to the country. The concept was simple, if politically dangerous. Instead of scattering Egypt's most valuable objects across multiple aging facilities, consolidate them into a single, purpose-built complex near Giza. That location choice was deliberate and controversial. Moving the narrative center of Egyptian history away from Cairo signaled a shift in how the state imagined tourism flows. The pyramids were already doing the work of attraction. The museum would do the work of interpretation and monetization. Critics at the time argued that concentrating so much cultural capital in one place created new vulnerabilities. A single site failure would have national consequences. Others accused the state of building a prestige project while neglecting regional museums. Those critiques were not ignored, but they were overridden by a colder calculation. Fragmentation diluted impact, while centralization amplified it. What changed between 1992 and today is not the logic, but the scale. At the time, the idea of housing over 100,000 artifacts under one roof seemed excessive. Today, it reads as inevitable. Global museums compete on narrative clarity, visitor experience, and technological integration. The old Egyptian museum could offer authenticity, but not coherence. The Grand Egyptian Museum was conceived as the opposite, not a warehouse of wonders, but a controlled storytelling environment where chronology, context, and spectacle could be synchronized. That philosophy explains why the project survived multiple governments, economic crises, and public skepticism. Once the state committed to reframing its past as a system rather than a shrine, retreat became politically impossible. This is the foundation on which everything else rests. The museum is not an answer to nostalgia. It is an answer to institutional failure, delivered at monumental scale. Once the decision was made, the Grand Egyptian Museum entered the phase that exposes every mega project to reality. Time. From the outside, the delays were easy to mock. From the inside, they were predictable. Construction formally began in the early 2000s, but momentum never followed a straight line. What looked like bureaucratic slowness was, in practice, a collision between engineering ambition, political instability, and global shocks that no feasibility study could fully model. The first major disruption came in 2011. Political unrest froze public spending, halted work on site, and shifted national priorities overnight. Contractors pulled back, timelines dissolved, and the project entered a limbo that lasted several years. During this period, the museum became a talking point rather than a construction site, invoked by politicians as either proof of resilience or evidence of mismanagement, depending on the audience. That pause carried a cost that rarely appears in promotional material. Idle construction does not stand still financially. Equipment depreciates, materials age, and design assumptions become outdated. Every year of delay added layers of renegotiation, reapproval, and redesign. The price tag did not simply rise because Egypt was slow. It rose because the world around the project changed. When work resumed in the mid-2010, it did so under a different logic. The museum was no longer just a cultural project waiting for a better moment. It was framed as a symbol of recovery and stability. Milestones became political events. None was more visible than the relocation of the colossal statue of Ramses II in 2018. Weighing more than 82 tons, the move was not just an engineering operation, it was theater. A way to say the project was real again, and irreversible. Then came the pandemic. Global supply chains fractured. International specialists could not travel, and construction slowed across the planet. For the museum, this meant further postponements and rising costs. But unlike earlier interruptions, this one came with a strategic pivot. Project managers used the slowdown to refine internal systems, expand digital infrastructure, and renegotiate exhibition timelines rather than simply waiting it out. By the early 2020, the narrative had shifted again. Instead of promising a single grand opening that kept slipping, authorities adopted phased access. Limited galleries opened, operational systems were stress-tested, and visitor flow was studied under real conditions. This approach was less glamorous, but more honest. It treated the museum as an evolving institution rather than a ceremonial ribbon-cutting. The accumulated effect of these delays is easy to frame as failure. In reality, they reveal the true cost structure of symbolic architecture. When a building is meant to carry national meaning, it becomes vulnerable to every national shock. The Grand Egyptian Museum survived not because it avoided disruption, but because the state recalculated its value after each one. What emerged from this prolonged timeline is a project that absorbed instability rather than collapsing under it. The delays reshaped the museum into something more controlled, more cautious, and arguably more aligned with contemporary museum economics. The opening did not mark the end of the struggle. It marked the point where delay itself became part of the story the building tells. Strip away the promotional language, and the Grand Egyptian Museum is best understood as a machine built to manage scale. Its architecture is not subtle, and it is not meant to be. Every major design decision serves flow, visibility, and control rather than ornament. The building's defining gesture, a chamfered triangular form aligned precisely with the pyramids of Khufu and Menkaure, is not symbolic poetry, it is directional engineering. Visitors are constantly oriented toward the ancient skyline, whether they realize it or not. The facade, an 800-meter expanse of translucent alabaster stone, performs multiple functions at once. It filters the harsh desert light, reduces heat load, and creates a visual continuity between Stone Age monuments and modern construction. At certain times of day, the wall glows rather than reflects, turning the museum itself into a calibrated lighting device. This is not romance. It is climate control disguised as aesthetics. Inside, the logic becomes even clearer. The central atrium rises to approximately 32 meters, a vertical volume designed to absorb crowds without bottlenecks. Airports use the same principle. Height buys patience. Visitors move slower, noise disperses, and congestion feels less aggressive even when numbers are high. Dominating this space is the statue of Ramses II, positioned not as a relic, but as an anchor. At over 82 tons, its relocation in 2018 required a choreography of specialized transport vehicles, vibration analysis, and route reinforcement across Cairo. The move was widely televised for a reason. It demonstrated that Egypt could still execute complex logistics at national scale. From the atrium, the grand staircase functions as the museum's narrative spine. Flanked by statues of rulers and deities, it guides visitors upward through chronological layers, while maintaining visual contact with the pyramids outside. This is not accidental. The design prevents disorientation. No matter how deep a visitor goes into curated history, the ancient landscape remains present, framed deliberately through glass apertures. Structurally, the museum relies heavily on steel girders and reinforced concrete systems capable of spanning vast open halls without intrusive supports. Some interior steel elements reach heights of more than 26 meters, enabling uninterrupted exhibition spaces that can be reconfigured as curatorial strategies evolve. Flexibility here is financial prudence. Permanent layouts age quickly. Adaptable ones extend institutional lifespan. Behind the scenes, the technical infrastructure reads like that of a data center rather than a cultural venue. Environmental control systems regulate temperature and humidity within narrow tolerances to protect artifacts that have survived millennia but remain vulnerable to modern air. These systems operate independently across zones, allowing different galleries to maintain different conditions simultaneously. This is expensive to build and even more expensive to maintain. But without it, the museum would be a storage risk rather than a conservation standard. The building also integrates digital mapping, surveillance, and crowd monitoring tools that track movement patterns in real time. This information feeds operational decisions, from staffing allocation to emergency response planning. The goal is not surveillance theater, it is predictability. In a facility designed to host thousands of visitors per day, unpredictability is the enemy. Taken together, the architecture makes a clear statement. The Grand Egyptian Museum is not a temple built for quiet contemplation. It is a calibrated system designed to process history at industrial scale while preserving the illusion of intimacy. Whether that balance holds over decades will depend less on design awards and more on operational discipline. But as a piece of contemporary architectural engineering, the building does exactly what it was designed to do. If the building is the machine, the collection is the fuel. This is where the Grand Egyptian Museum moves from architectural statement to economic proposition. Officials regularly cite a figure of more than 100,000 artifacts, but that number alone explains nothing. What matters is concentration, sequencing, and exclusivity. The museum is not trying to show everything at once. It is trying to control when and how the most valuable narratives are consumed. At the center of that strategy is the complete collection of Tutankhamun. For the first time, approximately 5,398 objects associated with the boy king are displayed together in a single, purpose-built environment. That number is not inflated for effect. It includes everything from gold funerary equipment to fragile textiles that were previously kept in storage due to lack of suitable conditions. The selling point is not rarity alone, it is completeness. Visitors are no longer shown highlights, they are sold closure. This matters because Tutankhamun is not just an archaeological figure. He is a global brand. Market research commissioned by Egypt's tourism authorities has consistently shown that Tutankhamun recognition among international visitors rivals that of the pyramids themselves. By consolidating the entire collection, the museum creates a repeat visit incentive that did not exist before. You cannot absorb 5,000 objects in a single visit, and the museum is designed to make sure you know that. The strategy extends beyond Tutankhamun. One of the most quietly ambitious projects inside the museum is the restoration and display of the solar boats of Khufu. These cedar wood vessels, originally buried near the Great Pyramid, are being reassembled from roughly 1,650 fragments in a glass-enclosed conservation space open to the public. This is not conservation theater for specialists. It is transparency as spectacle. Visitors watch experts work in real time, turning preservation into performance. The logic here is borrowed directly from modern science museums and even open kitchen restaurants. Process creates trust, and trust extends engagement. Instead of hiding conservation behind walls, the museum uses it to justify longer visits and higher perceived value. This approach also reframes Egyptian archaeology as active rather than frozen, countering the idea that everything important was discovered a century ago. Beyond the headline collections, the museum's galleries are organized thematically rather than strictly chronologically. Religion, governance, daily life, and death are treated as parallel systems rather than linear chapters. This structure allows curators to rotate objects without dismantling entire narratives. It also enables targeted updates tied to anniversaries, new research, or traveling exhibitions. In other words, content refresh becomes operationally manageable. There is a hard economic reason for this flexibility. Static museums age badly. Return rates drop once the novelty fades. By designing exhibitions that can evolve without structural overhaul, the Grand Egyptian Museum positions itself less as a one-time pilgrimage and more as a recurring destination. This is how modern cultural institutions justify billion-dollar capital investments. Critics argue that this approach risks turning history into a subscription service, where meaning is constantly repackaged to maintain traffic. That criticism is not wrong, but it ignores the alternative. Without sustained visitor revenue, conservation budgets shrink, research slows, and artifacts retreat back into storage. Visibility, in this context, is not a betrayal of scholarship. It is a funding mechanism. What the museum ultimately offers is not access to the past in its raw form. It offers a managed encounter, calibrated for scale, repetition, and revenue. Whether that is uncomfortable or inevitable depends on perspective. What is clear is that the Grand Egyptian Museum is no longer gambling on awe alone. It is betting on content strategy. Strip away the language of heritage and preservation, and the Grand Egyptian Museum reveals its real test: numbers. Not artifacts, but visitors, spending, and throughput. From the beginning, the project was justified internally as an economic engine, not a cultural luxury. The targets attached to it are explicit. Egyptian planners have repeatedly cited a goal of roughly 7 million visitors per year once operations stabilize, with a practical daily cap of around 20,000 people to prevent system overload and conservation stress. Those figures are not aspirational guesswork. They are modeled against Egypt's broader tourism rebound. In 2024, Egypt recorded approximately 15.7 million international arrivals, the highest number in its history. Preliminary government data for the first 9 months of 2025 already indicated roughly 15 million visitors, suggesting that demand has remained resilient despite regional instability. The museum is designed to capture a disproportionate share of that traffic by positioning itself as unavoidable rather than optional. The economics follow familiar patterns. Longer visits mean higher ancillary spending. Food services, guided tours, branded retail, and premium experiences inside the museum are all calibrated to raise per capita revenue. According to World Travel and Tourism Council benchmarks, cultural tourists spend between 20 and 30% more per day than leisure tourists focused solely on recreation. The museum's layout, with controlled exit paths leading through commercial zones, reflects that data without apology. Transportation integration reinforces the same logic. Dedicated road links from Cairo and Giza, expanded parking capacity, and coordinated tour bus scheduling are not about convenience, they are about reducing friction. Every additional hour a visitor spends navigating logistics is an hour not spent consuming services. The museum is designed to minimize that leakage. There is also a macroeconomic layer. Tourism accounts for roughly 10% of Egypt's gross domestic product and employs millions directly and indirectly. By concentrating a high-value attraction near existing infrastructure, the state avoids the cost of building entirely new tourist cities. The Grand Egyptian Museum functions as a multiplier rather than a standalone destination, extending stays in Cairo and redistributing spending toward cultural rather than purely recreational sectors. This is where the project's critics sharpen their knives. They argue that turning a museum into a revenue optimization system risks flattening historical complexity into digestible products. There is truth in that concern, but it sidesteps a harsher reality. Museums without sustainable income models either stagnate or become dependent on unpredictable state subsidies. The Grand Egyptian Museum is an attempt to preempt that trap by engineering demand rather than hoping for generosity. Security and risk management further complicate the equation. Large crowds near symbolic sites are liabilities as much as assets. The museum's crowd monitoring systems, layered security screening, and controlled access points are designed to keep operations predictable even during peak seasons. This is not paranoia. It is actuarial thinking applied to culture. What emerges is a picture that may unsettle purists, but makes sense to policymakers. The Grand Egyptian Museum is treated as a piece of national economic infrastructure, no different in planning logic from a port or an airport. Its success will not be measured in academic citations or architectural praise. It will be measured in sustained visitor flow, stable revenue, and its ability to absorb shocks without shutting down. In that sense, the museum is less a monument to the past than a stress test for Egypt's future tourism model. The artifacts are ancient. The calculus behind them is thoroughly modern. At this point, the Grand Egyptian Museum stops being a construction story and becomes a question of intent. Egypt has not simply built a bigger museum. It has restructured how its past is packaged, accessed, and sold. The museum functions as a national narrative filter, deciding which stories are foregrounded, which objects become icons, and which interpretations are repeated at industrial scale. That power matters more than any facade or floor plan. Supporters frame the project as overdue modernization. They argue that without this level of investment, Egypt risked losing control over its own heritage, watching artifacts decay in storage while foreign museums set the global narrative. From that angle, the Grand Egyptian Museum is not commercialization. It is reclamation, executed with the tools of the 21st century. Critics see something else. They see a civilization flattened into a visitor pipeline where history is optimized for flow rates and retail conversion. They point out that ticket prices place the full experience out of reach for many Egyptians, turning national heritage into a premium product primarily consumed by foreigners. They warn that centralization near Giza marginalizes regional museums and reinforces a single, state-approved version of the past. Both readings can be true at the same time. The museum does preserve artifacts under world-class conditions. It also monetizes them aggressively. It does elevate Egypt's global cultural standing. It also subjects history to market logic. The uncomfortable reality is that in a global tourism economy, refusing that logic often means surrendering relevance altogether. There are also risks Egypt cannot fully control. Regional instability can disrupt travel overnight. Security incidents can undo years of brand building in a single news cycle. Maintenance costs for a facility of this scale will not shrink with time. Climate control systems age, staffing costs rise, and novelty fades. The museum must continuously justify its operating budget long after the opening headlines disappear. What the Grand Egyptian Museum ultimately represents is a bet. A bet that scale can protect heritage rather than dilute it. A bet that visibility funds preservation instead of corrupting it. and a bet that a nation can turn its deepest history into a sustainable economic asset without hollowing it out. Whether that bet pays off will not be decided in the opening year or even the first decade. It will be decided by how adaptable the institution proves once the crowds thin, the systems strain, and the political spotlight moves on. For now, Egypt has made its move, loudly and at enormous cost. Thank you for watching, and if you have made it this far, let us know what you think about this project. Do you see the Grand Egyptian Museum as a necessary evolution, or as history turned into a product? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.